Welcome to week 10 of HOS 121. This week we look at psychosocial development in young adulthood, which is the developmental period from the end of adolescence, which would be from around 18 to 20, until around age 40. And in this first lecture of the week, we are looking at changes to the self in adulthood.
We'll begin by asking the question, when does someone become an adult? And then talk a little bit about how people tend to start thinking about the self in adulthood, as well as how self-concept and self-esteem changes in adulthood. And we'll ask the question about personality in adulthood and whether it changes, and if so, how it might change and under what circumstances. So I first wanted to mention something I mentioned also in the week on adolescence, which is that people who study human development are now talking about a developmental period called emerging adulthood, which sits between late adolescence and the first part of young adulthood. So it goes from about 18 to the mid to late 20s. And this is a period of time in which young people in Western cultures, are no longer adolescents, but they're not yet fully launched, fully independent adults. So this is a picture on the slide of a young man sitting in a sandbox with a headline, "They just won't grow up." And you often hear news programs talking about emerging adults and why won't they leave home and why won't they do this. But there's a lot of cultural reasons why scholars who are looking at young emerging adulthood think that people are delaying these kinds of decisions. So people are now tending to go to university longer, get more education. They're tending to delay marriage and delay childbirth and do other things in their 20s as well, like travel, for example. And so they're often waiting on some of the big life changes that we'll talk about later in these lectures in terms of the transition to a committed partnership and a transition to having children or not.
So when does someone become an adult? Well, there's different ways that we mark that or answer that question, and we'll discuss this in tutorial as well. But first, one way that people think about whether someone's an adult or not is really around role transitions. So have they assumed new roles and responsibilities that mark them out as an adult? And so, for example, marriage is often looked at as a marker of being an adult. Another is, whether someone has gone through a rite of passage. Now, in some more traditional cultures and in some religious traditions, there are clearly marked rituals that mark the change between adolescence and adulthood. So, for example, in the Jewish tradition, bar mitzvahs for boys, bat mitzvahs for girls, mark the time when a young person is considered to be an adult member of the community. And there are some other cultures, like Latin American cultures, such as Mexican families, for example, will often celebrate a quinceañera, which is a celebration of a girl's 15th birthday, as the marker of when she becomes a woman. But in the Western cultures, we don't tend to have very clearly marked rituals that show that you're an adult from one age to another. There are certain things like getting your driver's license, but it doesn't necessarily bring the full responsibilities of adulthood. So what's often used as a marker of whether someone's an adult or not is whether they've gained financial independence. And so that may be when someone has started full-time work outside once they complete secondary school, and maybe that they've gone to universities and then graduated and entered the workforce, or that they've joined the military. And that is often when we tend to think of someone, when they are financially independent, as being a full-fledged adult. As people enter into adulthood, they assume responsibility over making decisions about their lives, which for many people involves setting goals and making plans. And research from the field of psychology suggests that young adults create a lifespan construct that represents a unified sense of their past, their present, and their future. And that this becomes manifested in two ways. So one is through a scenario that maps out their future based on a social clock. And if you recall, we talked about social clocks in week 1. That's when a person feels that it's their internal sense of when they want to achieve certain types of goals, or when they expect to be involved in certain kinds of events. So when they think that parenthood might be right for them, or when they want to be getting married or retiring or starting a career. And that also psychologists have also looked at how people put together a story about their lives, an autobiography or a narrative that organizes their past events into a coherent structure with a beginning, middle, and anticipated end. And we talked about this also in week 2, where we we read an article about how people sort of tell life stories. And uh, the article mentioned Professor Dan McAdams, who's a professor of psychology at Northwestern, and he's really well known in this field. And he talks about how narratives that people have about their lives actually guide their behaviors around not just how they see themselves in the past, but how a person sees himself in the future. And this relates to the idea of the real and imagined self that was the topic for your reflection 1C. So when we think about our futures, the idea of possible selves comes up, which is again the idea of a, a possible self, an imagined self, relates to self-concept, and it's about what someone could become, what they would like to become, and also what they're afraid of becoming. So hope for selves can reflect personal goals that people have set for themselves, like becoming rich and famous, or getting in shape, or assuming some kind of leadership role in an organization. But then people also have feared selves that they want to avoid. So someone may hope to avoid being alone, or being unsuccessful. And research on this self-concept, often people mentioned fears of having poor physical health or poor physical conditioning. And actually, there's evidence that the way that people see their possible selves can be a powerful motivator. So as young adults and adults in general are thinking about their futures and making plans, possible selves help people think about how they will transition to different roles. So for example, someone who is um, staying home at a certain point as a parent of a young child may have a sense of her possible self as being back at work and having a certain kind of position in a particular profession, and that having that idea of a possible self can be a motivator to go back to school and get more education and go after a certain career. So again, it's part of our self-concept, and it helps us to think about our futures. So over the course of the subject, we've talked about self-concept and how it evolves in middle childhood, where it tends to be very concrete. Children talk about their age, maybe things they like, things that are direct, observable types of things about them. And then in middle childhood, it tends to involve group memberships. I go to this school. I'm a part of this kind of activity. I do this kind of sport. And then in adolescence, it tends to become more abstract and psychological. And self-concept continues to change in adulthood. So how we answer the question, who am I, will continue to change as we go through life experiences. So this is an example of a figure, Sarah, who at one point in time, at age 30, has a self-concept where she describes herself as a wife and a mom and a part-time administrative assistant, and that she's generous and kind to others. So she's describing herself using personality traits, generosity and kindness. She's using relational identity. I'm a wife, I'm a mom. She's relating it to employment, which is very common for adults. When you go and meet somebody at a party, tell me about yourself. They often will tell you about their jobs. But then for Sarah, it changes. So she has different experiences. She still notes that she's a mom, but now she's divorced at age 38 and she's studying commerce at uni, and she still identifies herself as having the traits of being generous and kind. So self-concept, again, can change in the adult years as people take on or change the roles that they're in. Wife, mother, husband, partner, boyfriend, girlfriend, friend, carer, having different experiences, taking on new professional roles. All of these things can change the way that we answer that question of who am I?
So self-esteem in adulthood can also change, and it really is dependent on experience. So it can go down, it can go up, but there's some evidence that, in terms of a general trend in adulthood, that self-esteem tends to rise gradually as people are able to cope successfully with challenges of adult life. Your reading for week 5 on page 186 of the reader talks about some evidence that comes from a large survey, internet-based survey with 30,000 respondents, that 300,000 respondents, sorry, that there is a kind of trend toward increasing self-esteem over the adult years. And other research has suggested that high self-esteem is maintained by adults coming to appreciate sort of the real self and the real experiences they have, and and reducing the difference between the real self and the ideal self. So again, there's some research that's talked about in chapter 5 that discusses this, but that older adults tend to scale down their vision of what they can ideally be and what they'll likely be, and begin to sort of accept and appreciate what it is that they have done and what they are. And so that relates also to this changing standards of self-evaluation. People often will start making comparisons to older adults, to people who have had issues like health issues, and therefore can often then appreciate what it is that they have in terms of good health, for example. And a lot of it has to do with, in terms of self-esteem, culture has an important contribution to self-esteem. So social context, and as part of that culture, influences how people feel about themselves. So self-esteem in individualistic cultures like Australia tends to be pretty high, whereas people can be somewhat more modest in terms of their self-esteem, maybe more self-critical and more aware of inadequacies in more collectivist societies. So that's something that research suggests. So picking up on that last point, there also are other cultural differences in terms of views on the self. So this is from your reader, this table. And in general, various research studies that are cited here suggest that there are ways that we see ourselves that are culturally influenced. So in individualistic societies such as Australia, people tend to see themselves as, again, very individual, separate from others, independent, tend to focus on personality and describing themselves in using the kind of trait-like qualities that are part of the big 5 of personality, versus people in collectivist societies such as Japan, Singapore, Indonesia, and others, will tend to identify that they are different in different contexts, again, sort of reflecting a view of the self as being interdependent on others. So they might highlight how they are with family and then highlight how they are in a work setting and how that's different, whereas people who come from individualistic societies tend to look at more the stable traits that tend to be similar across contexts. And so that's where the sort of, in self-esteem, as I already mentioned, there's people from individualistic societies, self-esteem is important and tend to see themselves as being above average, whatever the average is, when they're asked questions on questionnaires, surveys, whereas people in collectivistic societies are often mention, more of a sense of how they compare to others, and are not necessarily always seeing themselves as a favorable of a light. And again, that comes down to a key difference, which is around emphasis on uniqueness, which is characteristic of people who are part of individualistic societies, versus emphasis on group membership and similarities to others. So how one is similar to others rather than how one stands apart. And there's also some interesting research that's described in your reader about personality in adulthood and under what circumstances it changes and how under what circumstances it stays the same. So some aspects of personality and personality overall has a certain amount of stability that comes from heredity, first of all, the genetic aspects of personality, which have their roots in temperament that we've talked about from early childhood. The lasting effects of early childhood experiences, which is a theme we also look at this week when we look at attachment in adult relationships. Our early childhood experiences, particularly with our attachment figures, tend to continue to influence us in adulthood, and so there's some continuity there. And also the ways in which the genes that we have and the environments we receive from our parents tend to correlate. So they're because we share both genes and environments with our parents, and they're not separate. So people who have certain tendencies tend towards certain things in terms of their choice of environment. So those types of aspects of experience relate to the reasons why we see a lot of stability in personality in the adult years. But personality also can change. So, for example, having certain kinds of diseases are associated with changes in personality. So, for example, having Huntington's or Alzheimer's disease, which we'll talk about Alzheimer's disease in our in older adulthood, that can change personality, can make someone more moody or irritable. And also, there are some differences that come with maturation. So as people get older, there are some general trends towards differences in personality. So activity level, in terms of people's energy and how much they do things, that tends to go down. Openness to experience tends to decrease, and agreeableness tends to increase. So those are trends you see as people kind of move through their lifespan. Changes in one's environment also, relate to personality. So if people have big changes, including major life events, changes to the society that they're in, changes to the roles that they play in society, aspect of personality may also change. For example, their level of extroversion may relate to taking on a particular role that requires a lot of extroversion, being really outgoing. And then you can also see change when there's a poor fit between the person and their environment. And person and environment is a perspective that we particularly focus on in social work. We often look at social problems that arise from a poor fit between a person and their environment. And you can see changes and impacts on personality when people are constrained by the environment that they're in. So your reading talks about sort of social context and how women who might have been very outgoing, extroverted in earlier decades may have been limited based on societal expectations of women, and how that influences the expression of their personality. But there's certainly who we are has a lot to do with the context that we're in. So we're going to stop this lecture here, and we're going to pick up on changes that occur that are normative in young adulthood around life transitions and assuming new roles and relationships, and then look at the role of attachment in adulthood.